Good afternoon, and welcome to the Safety Commission meeting. The last time when many of us were together was when the mayor received the report from Matrix, and then I think since then, the commissioners had an opportunity to attend meetings, I think when Matrix presented. We're coming into the home stretch. You may not believe this, but we really, really are. So today, we're going to hear from our subcommittees. They're making presentations. And this is how we have structured this. We'll first hear from hiring, and these are in 30-minute increments. So I'm going to ask commissioners, if you have questions, please jot them down. We want to make sure that we can receive all of the presentations, and then you can see on the agenda that we have time for Q&A. But these are going to be just straight presentations today. So we'll have hiring, and then we'll have training, then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back for 21st Century Policing, Hot Topics Q&A. Are there any questions or concerns from the commissioners before we start? No? Then Andrea? We are prepared to hear from you today. And again, as always, just a huge thank you to the commissioners, because during this last, I'd say at least 60 days, you have been working on your reports, you've been going through the Matrix materials, and so even though maybe we haven't seen each other, the work has definitely continued in between the meetings, and we are very, very, very appreciative.
I'd like to thank Brian's office and his staff for working with us and being very agile during the multiple requests that we made to talk with additional people to further enhance how the hiring and recruiting process is conducted, both from a historical perspective and present day, and leading us to the future. And then I also would like to add that working with the individuals on my subcommittee were just really awesome to work with, so we learned a lot. I think throughout the time that we've listened to presenters and listened within our subcommittee, it became clear that strong relationships of trust really occur when the police agency and the community work together and foster that strong sense of community safety and effective policing. And so they need one another to make that happen. And I think that when we looked at the research material throughout our time, we plucked out a comment from the 2007 IACP report that talked about the whole fairness and neutrality of policing and 21st century policing, and that is the department reflects the community. And when it reflects the community, it serves to help the community build that trust. And that it offers an understanding and responsiveness and really helps to reduce those perceptions of bias. And that's what kind of led us and kept us on the road in how we pursued hiring and recruitment. So before we go into our recommendations, I would like for us to kind of take note of some of the key parts of our narrative that we will have in the report, some of those takeaways that really, I think, enhance and broaden the recommendations. We'll touch upon those in the recommendations, but we'd like for everybody to kind of leave with a sense of some of the things that we thought was important for us and important for making the report kind of more robust. And that is to create a robust department. The chief does not act in a vacuum, and we've said that before. He or she really will depend upon the city elected officials and civilian employees to share in supporting the initiatives that need to be done or need to be changed and enhanced in order to get those recommendations met, or at least to pick and choose which are we going to prioritize to make a more enhanced selection and hiring process. And so, we've made some recommendations. I think Matrix has made some recommendations. We've all asked, how is that fiscal responsibility going to be made? And then Chief can't act alone with that. So a strategic plan that's rooted in everybody's buy-in is necessary as we go forward. So in order to create that strategic plan that attracts, increases, and very importantly, retains diverse candidates, the CDP leadership and community involvement has to work together, has to be solution-based in how they approach this topic. It's not a quick fix. It will take some planning with deliberate steps, deliberate action. And once those practices are reviewed and improved, then the leadership has to be held accountable to their recruitment and their hiring plan. If that's something that they create, then they have to be held accountable. Measurable goals have to be developed, and how they meet those goals and make that transparent. And so those strategies to increase diversity must be incorporated to their long-term strategic plan, and to report out on those and to highlight that. And then beyond the benefit of engagement and collaboration, we recommend that community members are asked to participate in selection processes of the recruits and to further support the CDP's community relationships. That allows the community to become involved, and that allows the community to really assess and evaluate and work with leadership, work with the individuals within the CDP and city leadership to tell them what exactly is needed in their particular areas of the community and their neighborhoods, and how the selection process can help with their needs. We also then, based upon our multiple interviews, believe that there should be some type of case management. Now, we use that loosely, but a case management model that highlights each individual applicant so that from the beginning they are monitored each way, each step, and that if there are some situations or some concerns about the applicant, or that the applicant has concerns, that they can identify that individual and talk with them and get the information that they need to be successful. So we looked also at the applicant disqualification points, and so we're also recommending that those be looked at in depth to ensure that any exclusion decisions that are made are based on essential selection standards. And we think that a case management process could validate any of those disqualifiers that there might be made on that applicant. And again, that if the applicant needs assistance through the process, they can get that. So our recommendations are as follows. So again, kind of broadening the scope of some of the key takeaways that we made. And it's a little bit, the font is just a little bit tiny, but we're looking at the chief having ownership, kind of like the buck stops with the chief, and their leadership is accountable to hiring and training and being accountable to that. We think that the process should be assigned to one particular deputy chief, and that deputy chief is responsible for those outcomes, and that the diversity outcomes are based upon, women, racial and ethnic minorities that are throughout the city. We are recommending that the HR Bureau be moved from the Public Accountability Subdivision and placing it in the Community Services Subdivision. We think it makes sense that all of the recruitment, hiring, training, professional standards are interconnected in some way in how we are recruiting and hiring and ultimately making that offer to a specific candidate, and that the recruitment unit is assigned to the Human Resource Bureau, and that those individuals, both officer and civilian, be assigned to only recruitment and hiring. We also are recommending that we expand the review of prospective recruits, so some joint review committee to make recommendations to the safety committee. Again, that transparency and accountability factor is important with this type of process. And then we are also recommending the removal of Civil Service Commission human resource responsibilities from the Police Department Administrative Subdivision and placed within the general city human resources subdivision. And then we believe that the Director of Diversity Inclusion should report directly to the mayor, the mayor's office, and the Public Safety Director. Additional general recommendations is that, expanding on our key takeaway, establishing the concept of case management, and In addition to case management, that there be an independent audit of the recruiting and testing that then is included in the annual report. And then, extremely important is that a realistic budget be met, created. We listened to Chief Quinlan talk to us that of all of his recommendations as he looks forward, those recommendations are eating into his future budget, which potentially could take away from issues in the future. We think that the budget should be made for the here and now and assist in those recommendations that, as a city, are important to make an inclusive department. We also are recommending that there are civilian liaisons that are assigned to the recruiting unit and that they represent the various communities so that they can work with individuals in the community and have an understanding of recruitment with them if there's any roadblocks or additional information that they need. We believe that recruiting materials should be available in multiple languages. We know that there's, I think, Spanish out there, maybe Somali out there, but there needs to be additional languages. Recruiting incentive to include underrepresented minorities with that intentional effort to recruit successful candidates that meet the hiring standards. And then again, connecting the requirements, the division's requirements with an Explorer program or CTE program or other programs within the city that are established that may draw upon a more youthful pool and help develop them with interest to become police officers. We looked again at civilian jobs. Could there be a way that there is a co-recruiting or referral with civilian jobs that they've already established themselves as city employees with the idea of being developed and mentored to take the police applicant job and then have additional points associated with that, and looking at minimum age requirements and fitness level. We also are wanting a benchmark of different cities that are similar in size and population and demographics to Columbus, for there to be a thorough benchmarking of recruiting and hiring standards. We think that there are some residency incentive programs nationally. We saw in some of our research that there is a program in Atlanta that might be applicable or worthy of a further in-depth investigation to see how that's done. We are also recommending that there is a referral-based incentive program for city residents and underrepresented minorities. We think that if individuals reside in the community in which they serve, they may be a more viable resource to the community. We would like to see a ceasing of the practice of using credit scores to screen prospective recruits. And then we would like to see it investigated, further reviewed, that there be an establishment of a lateral process from OPATA certified officers within the state, outside the city of Columbus, and then possibly outside of the state that meets the standards. There might be additional, there will be additional training needs, but that could open up the pool of a more diverse applicant that may want to come to Columbus. Recommendations for testing. We looked at bonus points, and again, can we add additional points to those alumni of the Explorer and Cadet program, current city civilian employees? Can additional points be added for those candidates that have language competency, fluency, based upon some type of testing? We looked at preferential points on COPE for successful completion of prior training programs, utilizing that. We looked at cultural competency training for those scoring on COPE. And then adding trained community members to the COPE panel. And then those COPE scenarios designed to bring out the problematic biases that some candidates might have. And then in our discussions, another recommendation that we have for testing is that the manager who has responsibility for the background investigative unit and the polygraph testing and oral board really should be provided the opportunity to obtain polygraph training and certification and to complete that certification within a reasonable time. We think without the administrator over that unit not having that certification, how does one audit the integrity of the polygraph? Or how does one understand that whatever questions or whatever outcomes based upon that polygraph are within the polygraph standards? And then our other recommendations, miscellaneous recommendations that we looked at in terms of EEO and sexual harassment complaints, moving that from internal affairs to the City of Columbus EEO office, submit all testing tools and materials for a third-party cultural relevancy review, and also to review implicit bias, and then establish a mentorship program through the Training Academy. And we looked at potentially for the first 3 years, especially for our women, minorities, and the LGBTQ community. And then taking a look, further investigation, and updating the uniform standards to allow for culturally-based head coverings. Topics to further explore. We would like some of those problematic practices in the polygraph to be taken a look at. And again, one of our solutions is to have the administrator trained in that so that they can review and determine if there's any conclusions of potential bias in those questions or how it was conducted. We would address the perceived subjective nature and interrogative practices of an oral review process or review board process. And it seems, based upon individuals that we spoke to, that there appears to be differences in how some people are questioned within that oral review board, and then the conclusions based upon the nature of that questioning. And then we would like to assess the knowledge, skills, and impartiality of the members to create a diverse and inclusive oral review board. We recommend that there be a review to the practice of subjectively applying perceived qualifiers and looking at the background checks to certain candidates and not for others. Again, that was information that was shared with us. And then we recommend that the training committee research and the implicit bias training and how that could be implemented. We asked several questions, and one was, can the civil service test be offered more than once a year? Sometimes it seems like the length of time that it takes for that test to be concluded. We lose a lot of candidates. Can it be shortened? Can it be expedited? What does this do then to the actual hiring practice if we make the civil service process a little bit more easy? And then, again, in terms of what was shared with us, some candidates are believing that if they are not successfully selected, there is no feedback to them to make a determination of what part of that process did they not successfully complete. If they pursue this again, how can they do better with the next selection process? And then to review putting the candidates on hold, and then further exploring the current citizenship requirements. We were asked to consider topics or conversations from the public testimony. So this slide gives our recommendations from public testimony, and that was to take a look at implementing mandatory drug and alcohol testing on any officer that is involved in a critical incident, establishing an independent civilian review board, and then establishing a division of compliance and ethics. Not to say the other feedback and information that we received is not equally important, but those were the things that resonated with us as a subcommission. So that was a quick review of the past month's worth of work that we put into a very large topic. Chunking that down was quite the challenge, and how we looked at maybe some realistic points to address and recommend to the city. Thank you.
Thank you
Do a lot of
very
work.
much.
Thank you.
So again, a reminder, we're not going to take questions during the presentation. We'll wait until the very end. And so next we have Commissioner Brooke Burns on training.
Good afternoon, and Matthew will actually be coming and doing half of this presentation as well.
You don't have one? Oh, okay.
Yep. We're actually sending around a handout which gives a lot of details for each of our recommendations. We've got some fun footnotes, so if you want to go and look up any of the studies or potential resources that we've cited, those are there for you as well. Just to give you an overview of what our subcommittee did in our process, first we asked for and received essentially the entire CPD's training curriculum. So we went through electronic mountainfuls of what it is that the CPD cadets look at during their training, what they're trained on, the hours. We looked at their PowerPoints, and we combed through those things, and from that, took some time, talked with one another. We then went down to the Training Bureau and talked with Commander Meter and a number of the Training Bureau staff and asked questions based on what we found in the training, things that we thought might have been missing. We asked specifically about those. If there were some trainings that we maybe didn't receive initially, we did some follow-up on that. And then we also gave them the opportunity to tell us what it is that they thought would have been most helpful for CPD officers. And remember, for those who aren't familiar with the Training Academy, that there were requirements that come down from OPATA, and that often dictates both the schedule and the content of what officers are receiving. So from that, we made some training-specific curricula recommendations, but we also made some general recommendations that exceed the curriculum itself and instead go into some other areas that we found to be of relevance. For instance, and Matthew will talk about this one in particular, but some of our recommendations would actually require the mayor's office to engage with OPATA about vesting for purposes of when a cadet moves from probation to a full-time employee, because that often dictates whether the CPD can even determine if there's a problem. And oftentimes, by the time you see a problem, a person's employment vesting has already begun. And so that's also consistent with some of the recommendations we know have come from other subcommittees. So I am going to go over our curriculum-specific recommendations. Matthew will follow with our general recommendations that kind of go beyond the content of curriculum. And in addition to that, there's a couple other things we included in our report. The first, I will not go over with you here, but you can look at. When we looked through the full matrix report and tried to pull out the things we thought were relevant for training, a lot of them we actually cover in our report, so we didn't feel a need to kind of reiterate that here. But on page 6, you'll see where we highlighted some things that we just thought weren't necessarily clear in the matrix report. Feel free to look at those. It's a quick bullet list. But the last thing that Matthew's also going to cover is there were a lot of recommendations, whether it came from the public testimony or some of our dozens of commission meetings or some other conversations with subcommittees. There were some themes recurring, and some have already been mentioned today by Andrea, and I believe are in other subcommittee reports, but we do have a section in our report for additional recommendations. So things that weren't necessarily in the training purview, but we didn't know necessarily if they would fall into 21st century hot topics, and we didn't want them to get lost in the shuffle. So those were there as well. So on the first page, you'll see just a quick bullet list of our recommendations, and the pages that follow have some more details, which I'll do some highlighting. So our first curriculum-specific recommendation is that the CPD expand or modify the juvenile justice training to include adolescent development. The way the training model currently exists is it does a lot of procedure for how to effect a juvenile arrest. And what I mean by that is it follows with the U.S. Supreme Court's rules about the differences between adolescents and adults, not from a brain perspective, but from a perspective on how to effect an arrest or how to effect an interrogation. Which it's right, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court says, but that doesn't tell us policy and doesn't inform policy on how it is that CPD should be informed about the adolescent brain and how it matures and what that means about how children engage with officers. So by example, what I mean is an adult being told to stop, right, processes that differently than an adolescent does. Right? And even though some teenagers look like grown-ups, the reality is that what's inside their head is what's dictating their responsiveness. And so that is something that we felt was really missing from the curriculum that talks about juvenile justice, is that it really is important for officers to know and understand how a child's responsiveness or a teenager's response is going to be different from an adult and why that matters when it comes to assigning guilt, right? Because research has shown that a child running does not reflect guilty conscience, right? A child running can be fear, it can be impulsivity, could be peer pressure, a host of reasons, right? And so a lot of times we as adults may assign some malfeasance to a child's actions, and that's something we felt like officers really need to be trained on, because that in essence helps both our kids remain safe and the officers remain safe, is if there's this understanding of how the child brain develops. So in that recommendation, we gave a number of resources, both for potential places for the curriculum to be kind of supplemented, different organizations and groups that could take a look at the curriculum that's already there, and then fill in the parts that we felt were lacking. Our second recommendation for curriculum is that the CPD expand or modify the cultural competence material to include cultural awareness training germane to the diverse residents and communities currently residing in the city. So Columbus is actually one of the cities of its size with the highest immigrant population. And our CPD, in its just makeup, doesn't necessarily reflect that. But what we can do within the curriculum is make sure that our officers that are being trained have an understanding of the cultural impact of police engagement. For example, cultures that don't look eye to eye may seem as though they're being disrespectful, right, if an officer is trying to talk with them, but that's not necessarily the case, because while U.S. culture may be to look someone straight in the eye and be completely respectful, that's not the case across ethnicities. And so part of the thing we thought was lacking from CPD curriculum was an understanding of the different and various cultures that exist in the city and how that impacts engagement with police and community. And so, again, we have recommendations for why it is that officers be exposed to these communities, especially if they're going to be policing in those communities, and also resources of where that information can be found. We know that the Training Bureau already has one module that is tied to cultural kind of receptivity from the Kirwan Institute, but we feel like, and this was mentioned at a very early meeting, that right now a lot of the training modules are kind of siloed. And so there is not a lot of interplay. So you might get 2 hours of cultural awareness training here, but that does not ever translate over to use of force training and how it is that those cultural impacts will then determine use of force or how they're related. And so we talk about this in terms of both implicit and explicit bias, but also cultural awareness, that there needs to be crossover. So that way you're understanding not only is this a situation where maybe bias may interject itself, but why it's important to protect against that during those episodes. Kind of related, our third recommendation is to ensure that training materials, including videos, pictures, and PowerPoints, are inclusive and not racially or culturally biased or triggering. So an example of this is if during 600 hours of training at the academy, every time you hear the phrase bad guy, let's say 85% of those people are of the same race. Well, by the time the academy is done, then even from a Pavlovian response, we're going to associate bad guy with the pictures that were used during the presentations. Same thing with good guy, right? If our good guys always look the same way, then what does that set up in the mind of a cadet who's graduating? So we recommended that all the training be reviewed to see that PowerPoints, to see that presentations, videos, things of that nature are not in and of themselves intrinsically biased, so that they are not contributing further to what may already be perceived in the mind of a cadet about who a bad guy is and who a good guy is. Part of our recommendation also includes changing language so that we are not necessarily reducing people to these characters, but instead humanizing the folks even that are in the training videos, so that that in turn humanizes the people that our officers are going to be engaging with when they're out in the community. We also recommended to expand or modify the history of policing material to include a broader historical perspective. Currently, we found that the curriculum was pretty limited in that it looks at history of policing in Columbus, a little bit of policing in Ohio, but it doesn't give a national perspective. So we gave some ideas of what can be included. One of the things that we recommended was Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary, but essentially something that gives a picture that talks about history of policing, because we know that impacts how present-day community engages with police. And so part of that understanding is that officers be equipped with and know where the communities that they're policing, where their mindsets have been, so that it can help break down some of the animosity. Also, we recommended that the CPD include training that addresses officer burnout, secondary trauma, and coping mechanisms. One of the things we learned early on is that an officer can go from responding to a noise ordinance to a homicide, back to a domestic disturbance, all within a shift, and not have any downtime in between for processing that information or being able to deal emotionally with those things. And we also know that if at the end of a shift you've had a pretty emotionally charged night, that it doesn't bode well if you have a potentially heightened situation happen at the end of that shift. And so one of the things we recommend is that there be, just like so many of us in our professions have trauma-informed care, we learn how to take care of ourselves, right? That we give those same opportunities and same instruction to officers who are going through the academy, and not just make that an elective thing that officers can go through after they've graduated, but make it something that becomes part of the culture of the CPD. Because we know that we experience burnout as well, and so that an officer experiencing burnout not only is bad for their own health, but is also bad for the health of the community. And so our recommendation there includes how it is that officers can continuously engage in that type of self-care and have the resources to be able to do so. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, who's going to go through our general recommendations and then highlight some of our additional recommendations, even though I know a few of them overlap with other subcommittees.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. First, I just want to echo the thanks to Brooke, Ellen, Mary, and Jason for being on the subcommittee. A lot of calls, a lot of work, a lot of review into this document, and with that, I'm just going to jump right in. So our first general recommendation is expand the pool of trainers to include subject matter expert civilian instructors. So it goes somewhat similar with some of the curriculum specific, but essentially when you have law enforcement officers teaching new law enforcement officers, you get a lot of bias, and sometimes that's unintentional or it's implicit, but there's a lot of subject matter experts that are civilians who can bring their expertise to the table and hopefully present it in not only a neutral aspect, but an aspect where there can be some conversation between the cadets and whoever's presenting, so that they have an opportunity to open that up a little bit. Number two, integrate into each training module the impact of implicit and/or explicit bias, including racism, and strategies for officers to use in recognizing and mitigating their own biases. So it's kind of similar to what Brooke just talked about, but there's a lot of areas Subject control, use of force, de-escalation, crisis intervention, where again, there's a lot of things that are siloed and they're not being tied together. So when we're talking about de-escalation or subject control, there's not the integration of implicit or explicit bias, and we think that has to be there. There's just not enough on the definition of what implicit bias is. It's the definition of just one more thing in the academy that cadets hear, and then they move on to the next thing. It's procedural or whatever the case is. It needs to be tied in throughout, so when they see or hear the video we talked about with the bad guy, or hopefully the new name for that, when they hear you're going to control this subject, it's how are you applying this? Like you said, are people looking away? There's a lot of integration we want to see throughout our recommendations that really tie into one another. And I think this is one that instead of having in a single module, we think that instead of having this in a single module, we can tie in and use it throughout the examples in the academy. Number 3, require an overview of the crisis intervention training for all officers not currently certified. So essentially what that is, so the police department currently requires all new recruits to complete the 40 hours of CIT training. I know there's a goal to get all officers trained at some point. Basically, what we're looking at is to close the gap. So the officers who do not currently have the 40 hours or are not going to get the 40 hours of CIT training, here's an opportunity for them to have the awareness level. And with the awareness level, 1, hopefully can identify some behaviors, and 2, maybe say to themselves, we need a CIT trained officer for this incident, as we're currently, there may not be an opportunity for that because there's key elements they're unaware of and therefore missing. So essentially, it's I think it's a little bit more of a realistic goal to get everyone that training. It will overall improve the police department rather than saying immediately we need all officers to have that CIT training. That should help in that aspect. Number 4 is increase the probationary period for new recruits. This is something Brooke talked about in her opening remarks. Essentially, this is going to be more than just a decision that the chief can make, but going to the Civil Service Commission. What we looked at is as soon as a cadet graduates, they become a police officer, and there's essentially not enough time to make a true assessment of their behavior, how they're doing in the field, to really assess what they're doing. If they decide this officer's not going to make the cut, they're not doing well enough, they're not applying some of the things that we need, you just can't terminate them in time or correct the behavior because they're going to be a full-time police officer, and then, then they're essentially full-blooded in the union, et cetera. So if we have this where they start their probationary period as soon as they're done with the academy, you now have that full year to assess them, and ultimately that gives us better officers on the street. Like Brooke said, that one's going to take a little bit more. That's our recommendation is going to be very strong here to go to the Civil Service Commission and work with those other outside entities that we need to change that. Number 5 is tailor the OPATA training requirements to the size and function of law enforcement. We had a few different discussions throughout this, but essentially what this talks about is, or the example I'll use, is it doesn't matter if you're in Gahanna, Columbus, Cleveland, some small town that nobody has ever even heard of, everyone has to meet those same requirements through OPATA, and that really just doesn't make sense, because if you want to be a traffic officer in Columbus, then you go through the training to be a traffic officer. If you want to be in homicide, you go to homicide. SWAT, you go to SWAT. But for everyone in the state, for all agencies to have the exact same OPATA training, really it takes away from some of the other training that we as a commission are recommending for those officers. There's just not enough time in the academy. As we look through, it says, the second bullet on here is limit the 125 hours. 125 hours is a couple weeks on traffic instruction to the State Highway Patrol, and reduce the amount of instruction for municipal jurisdiction officers. State Highway Patrol obviously is in charge of the roads and the highways in the state. There's just not a need for those 3 weeks for the recruits to spend during that, especially if they're going to go and take the radar and LiDAR training at a later time. So essentially we're looking at, we had discussed, we didn't put it in here specifically, but we had discussed 3 tiers. I'm making these numbers up on the spot, but departments with less than 100, 100 to 500, and 500 to 2,000 officers, right? A recommendation where those are tiered out so that different departments have different levels of training. And Brooke, were you going to talk about anything on page 6, or you want me to keep rolling? Yeah. Super. So our additional recommendations, we have 7. The first 2 were already mentioned by Andrea. The first one is drug testing of officers when there's a critical incident. So we specifically did not put in here after every use of force because there would be so many. Certainly after deadly use of force or a critical incident, there should be drug testing for officers. Number 2, we agree the independent civilian review board should be established, modeling after boards from Baltimore, New York, Los Angeles, et cetera. This, again, is something that would take the Mayor's Office and Civil Service Commission working together on a greater effort here. Number 3 is the morality clause or a good faith oath. When you look at major companies, Fortune 500 companies, major CEOs, they have to take a good faith oath or morality clause that says they're going to do their job and they're going to do it the right way. I brought up, I think at one of the very first meetings, I had asked if there was a morality clause where officers signed basically saying, I'm not racist, I won't use racist tendencies, et cetera. But there's nothing that says they have to sign that. It just says, here's your oath of duty. So we're asking for a little bit more where they actually will apply those to new and existing officers. Number 4 is discipline protocols. Officer discipline needs to be reviewed for the length of time discipline is maintained in his or her file. Basically, we just weren't entirely confident in the timeframes when things get removed and why, so we think that should be lengthened. Number 5 is increase the awareness and size of the mobile crisis unit. So previously I said more folks should take, or all officers should have at least that 8-hour, but this looks at the 2 areas where mobile crisis unit can be better implemented. One is increase the awareness and the capabilities. Again, if an officer shows up on a call and they either don't know this unit exists or they're not fully familiar, they may just look over them and not use the resources that we already have here. And number 2 is because current staffing of mobile crisis unit just isn't effective. We need more out there. They're busy, they're doing a lot, they're not covering 24 hours a day. So increasing the shift availability will promote better services within the state, within the city. Number 6, felony murder statute. This came up as a recommendation. We had our public comment period, and I agree with this. Mason Sanders is in jail right now because of this. We just need the mayor to work with city officials, prosecutors, and legislature to get rid of it. We should not have a felony murder rule. It's a little bit embarrassing that Ohio is one of the few states where that still exists. And then number 7, the continuation of the Safety Advisory Commission. So we don't, whether it's in part or in full, I think in part, there's a good opportunity for us to continue. We've all worked extremely hard. We don't want to see this just drop or just fall or just pass on a report that then doesn't get the full attention. So one thing we talked about was having some members of the existing commission with some new members continue on, maybe a smaller group of commission members carry on, but one way or another, we don't want to just walk away. And I think looking at all of you and all the work that we've put into this and some of the conversations, obviously you've heard us say this before, not just us, but each other, and that is our 7th and last recommendation. Brooke, do you have anything else? All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'm almost tempted to say, let's just keep moving, but on the other hand, I said that we'd have a break after the first 2. I'm showing that it's 2:50. Can we reconvene at 3 o'clock for our next part? So we're going to have a break. We're now going to go into our next 2 presentations. And the next one is the 21st Century Policing, Dr. Chanel Jones.
Are we all standing up? Is that how we're doing it?
I tell you what, or would you rather have Vlad go first? No? Okay.
Chair Jackson, so that I can know what kind of notes to take. When will this report be released to the public?
We have 2 additional meetings. We have a meeting on October the 1st, which is another public meeting, and then on October 22nd, we, the commissioners, the entire commission, have to vote on these recommendations. It's not that the recommendations just come come from the subcommittees and they merge into a report. So we will actually vote, and then it will not be published until after that occurs. So I'm guessing it'll probably be the very end of October or early November. But this is not the final phase. Dr. Jones?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you all have had a wonderful and awesome day. So I'm going to change things up, and I'm going to ask the entire committee, the subcommittee, to come up here. Oh, they're already here. Wonderful.
Dr. Jones, I'm not sure you heard the announcement, we're not taking questions.
Okay.
During the presentation, but this was a straight presentation. There's one more, and then we'll go into a Q&A
Okay, after everything is done.
after everything's over.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So the 21st Century Policing Subcommittee, we looked at all of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the pillars, and we went through what we had heard from the various presentations. We did some additional research and information, and then we came up with several different recommendations, just a little bit of background about the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. We don't need to drive this thing home. It was established by President Barack Obama when he was in office. He got a bunch of people together, and they came up with 6 pillars: building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and officer wellness and safety. They said, these are the pillars for law enforcement agencies to really focus on and build upon in order to have a true and effective, meaningful law enforcement agency. So we looked at the Columbus Division of Police, what they were currently doing, and we looked for areas of opportunity and what could potentially be done. And so the other 2 members of our subcommittee is comprised of Mr. Aletha Wall right here and Officer Tracy Shaw, who they're going to chime in here any moment and on their respective areas. So, okay, we'll do that. All right, so the first one, and I'm going to actually ask Officer Shaw to come up because these were some of hers. So recommendation 1, the Columbus Division of Police should offer in-service crisis intervention training and require all officers to take it. Now, she'll provide a little bit of the context and background for that.
Hello, everyone. So the Columbus Division of Police, since it started CIT, Crisis Intervention Training, since it started in 2002, officers have received no additional training in that area, despite the opioid epidemic, despite so many service members coming back with PTSD and then not only that, the different resources that have changed with mental health, with substance abuse. There's been no in-service training, and with that, a lot of officers, they go through that 40-hour training block and they receive nothing. Nothing in the future. So we suggest that they receive annual in-service training. I think that would be a good idea. One, to keep up on de-escalation, the best practices for de-escalation, but also the resources that are available, mental health and substance abuse that I stated earlier. But like I said, we did a lot of research and looked around, and there are a lot of departments across the country that give as many as 60 hours per year in additional training. So it's like, here's the training, but then no additional training. And I will tell you that Columbus Division of Police is outstanding on training in a lot of different areas, firearms. We have a lot of training in firearms, bike, honor guard. We practice twice a year. But CIT training, something that officers are required to do on a daily basis, we don't receive any in-service training, so we would like to increase that. The second recommendation, currently, new call takers, dispatchers receive 8 hours of training in crisis intervention training. They say that the first 10 seconds are the most important to when someone is in crisis, and certainly if that person that is in need is calling, that's going to be that dispatcher or that call taker. So they currently get an abbreviated version of 8 hours, we feel like that is not enough, and so we would like our dispatchers and call takers to receive the full 40-hour block of training. The third recommendation that we looked at. So this started. Let me look here. So this started in June of 2018, a mobile crisis response team. And what the team does, it pairs an officer with a mental health professional, and together they respond to mental health calls for service when people are in crisis. So this started out as a pilot program with a division of police, and now it is permanent. We have 5 units that are out there. We recommend not only that it should continue, but that also that it should increase to cover all shifts. People become in crisis during all hours of the day, and it really does help. I have taught with CIT officers that are paired with these mobile response teams, these social workers, and they actually go on those calls and they respond together. And they really are making great work. It's kind of a holistic approach as well, because they're interested in getting that person treatment instead of locking them up, and then they may or may not get treatment there. And then they also do follow-ups as well for resources with substance abuse. It's a great program, but we do think, though, that it should get an additional amount of officers to cover all shifts. Recommendation number 4. So the Division of Police, it started physical fitness assessments that officers, it was on a voluntary basis for some, mandatory for others. And so basically it was on an annual review. They would have to go and get their body fat composition done, their sit-ups, bench press, leg press. They would have to go through a physical fitness assessment, and it was on a yearly, that was every year. What they found is that the only officers that were required to go were the ones that went. And so the city incentivized that, and now upwards of 80% of the department take part in that. So our suggestion on, you talk about the trauma that officers go through, and there's no mandatory assessment that they have to do, but if we incentivize it, so if the City of Columbus would incentivize some type of program for an annual mental health review, so they go talk to a therapist or psychologist, something along those lines, and even do a self-assessment. We were thinking about the burnout assessment, something along those lines annually, and this is on a volunteer type of basis. But if they would incentivize it, and so when I say incentivize, give 8 hours, give a day off. If every year you'll go and get checked out and make sure that our officers are as healthy as they can be, and that things present themselves, that we catch it early before it becomes a problem for that officer.
Thank you. So I know we're ahead on time, so I just wanted to say really quickly how fortunate I was to be on this subcommittee with 2 experts of this magnitude. Having an officer on our subcommittee provided us some insight that I don't think we would have had were Officer Shaw not there. And then Dr. Jones' credentials speak for themselves. Okay, so our 5th recommendation, that the Columbus Division of Police should establish a calendar of regularly scheduled community-based listening sessions in easily accessible locations across the city. What we found during our early investigation and research into this was that officers would go and select which community engagement events they wish to participate in, and then they would report it back to the division, and then it would be compiled in a list. But we found out that this list was arbitrary because there was no direction or strategic plan for how the officers were engaging. Now, that's not to negate the other times when the chief or other officers go to schools and things like that, because these are planned. But the overwhelming majority of the list consisted of voluntary activities by officers. So what we would like to do, because in one of the pillars of 21st century policing was to build trust and legitimacy. And in order to do that, I think that our officers, well, our investigation revealed that officers and the department or the division will be served by intentional engagement in the community, on the ground, in a non-enforcement capacity, where you're not coming as a person who is investigating a crime or looking to enforce the law at that moment, but just to listen to what the community has to say and how they perceive your interactions. So that was our fifth recommendation. We also did want to ensure that these were non-paid volunteer activities in highly traumatized communities, right? Not just across the city, because it will be easy to go into some of the more affluent parts of Columbus and not get a real feel for what some of the people who are most at risk of being victims of acts of violence or committing acts of violence really experience. So we should collaborate with, Columbus Division of Police should collaborate with community-based intervention specialists on crime trends, crime reduction strategies, and intervention services. Now, many of you may or may not know that my job at the Columbus Urban League is to provide intervention services to the most at risk. So we engage on corners, in alleys, in front of corner stores, at all hours of the day and night with individuals who, there are terms that are used, but some of those terms, if you're described as a gang member, can cause an injunction, which then can put you at risk for further problems when you're in court. So I shy away from those terms, but the most at risk and the most vulnerable in our communities, many of which are juveniles, to Dr. Burns's point earlier. But what we found is that there has been, from the inception of intervention, a reluctance by CPD. I don't know where it comes from, but there's been a reluctance for us to communicate about how we deploy all of our available resources, including intervention. So most of the information that I receive in the community is from the community. There's not a free flow of information currently from CPD to intervention. So what we're recommending there is that we increase that relationship or those types of interactions. 7, collaborate with institutions of higher learning. Here we have and develop to higher learning to educate, develop, train, analyze data, and evaluate policies that are implemented by the department. This is one of the things that we find critical. A couple of years ago, while I was in Los Angeles at the Gang Prevention and Intervention Conference, I sat next to a Dr. Kathy Kolnick, who is a professor at USC, and she informed me that they collaborate across 3 universities, UCLA, Cal State, and USC, to develop and analyze their case management policies around intervention, as well as their intervention policies and strategies. And so being in the shadow of The Ohio State University and having experts like Dr. Jones at our disposal and in our community, I think that we would be remiss if we were not to look at best practices like Los Angeles has shown us and implement those, or look to implement those here in Columbus, Ohio, and with the Columbus Division of Police.
So technology is supposed to make things better for us, more efficient for us. For those in the room that have done that did a ride along with the officers, I think a lot of you were very shocked to see how long some of these runs would take because of reports and the systems not talking to one another, minimizing out of one to get to another. I will say this, on a traffic stop in 2004, I could run a tag, push one button, and the picture of the registered owner would pop up. It would run that registered owner for warrants. And now that doesn't happen anymore. Now you'd have to close out of 3 different windows in order for that to come up. So from an officer safety standpoint, we would like to see the technology for the Division of Police upgraded to help those officers. It'll certainly make them safer. The other thing is that the repeated data input of the same information. Domestic violence arrest, for instance, are taking seasoned officers 4 hours. 4 hours. So if you have 6 officers on one shift on one precinct, for instance, and 2 of those officers go on a domestic, which is a very, very common call for patrol officers, those 2 officers now are out. And then so that now that precinct is being covered by not enough officers. And so we really would like someone to come in and look at the systems and integrate it. And the other thing is too is that if an officer comes across let's say a theft suspect, for instance, and there's not enough to charge them, for instance. But however, that vehicle that they were used, who their associations with, who they were with, those things are all they get put into report, but they're not easily accessed to that patrol officer. And so what we would like to do is see a system that can make officers more efficient when it comes to technology.
Another recommendation, one of the things we looked at was the probationary period for the Columbus Division of Police. It was good that we had Officer Shaw on because she actually works in the academy. And one of the things that we realized is that there are only 5 weeks allocated for officers to be evaluated after completing their field training. And so what we recommend is that the probationary period, it should be extended. It should begin post-graduation and then extend 12 months out. That is typically the average amongst other comparably sized law enforcement agencies across the country. And so we really need to take a hard look at that, even if that is going back and reviewing the city charter and making some amendments there. But we really need to go and extend the probationary period. In our report, we actually outline all the other cities, or several other cities that have probationary periods that begin at the point of time that they graduate. Recommendation 10. Did you want to talk about this one? You want me to? Okay. So one of the things we also found is that there's only one property room. And so this takes officers off the street when they have to go to the property room, which is located on a remote side of town, get everything checked in, and then get back. And what we found is that it takes several hours of their shift sometimes. And so that is just a functional issue. And so we think that, in a centrally located place in the city, we need an additional property room. If we go to our recommendation number 11, we also recommend that the holistic training, specifically the ABCs of training, we all participated in it. And one of the things that stood out is some of the lack of diversity. And so we don't want our officers to get into a situation in which we are conditioning them to fear certain demographics, certain racial groups, certain genders, but rather than knowing what to do in that scenario regardless of what the race of that person is. And so we recommend diversifying the scenario-based training. I'm going to start this off, but then I'm going to let Aletha come in and chime in on this one as well. But I will say one of the recommendations is also that police officers or officers within the Columbus Division of Police should be subject to mandatory post-incident drug and alcohol testing immediately following an officer-involved shooting. And I'll just give this little example. I gave it to Tracy when we had a meeting. So years and years and years and years and years and years ago, one of my first jobs I had was working at Target, right? Now, you all know those big tubs that you can purchase, those totes, I don't know what they're called, totes, those big totes, right? So somebody came and they were in this store, they were shopping, and they needed a tote. And little old me tried to help them get a tote, right? So the totes were at the very top of the shelf. And so trying to reach and get the totes, the lids and the totes, they all fell and they hit the poor woman in the head. Knocked her out, my bad. But anyways, after that situation, I had to go immediately, like immediately from that situation, I had to go and get a drug screen because it knocked the lady out. I didn't have any drugs. I wasn't on drugs. I was, in college at the time or high school student. So, of course, I wasn't taking it because I'm not like everybody else. But anyways, so the fact of the matter is I still had to get a drug test. Now, the lady lived. So imagine if we have a situation where somebody dies and we're not doing a post-incident drug test. That should raise a question. That should raise a concern for anybody if I had to get one at Target. Aletha, did you want to add to it?
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And Dr. Jones is going to come right back, so I don't want to, because, oh, no, actually, no, I think we're good. She's got a couple, so I apologize for that. The one thing that I would like to add is that I work closely with the community, and the question of the authority and the legitimacy of the policing that takes place in our community has always been, there's a shadow cast upon it because we don't know. And I had this conversation in the community about whether our officers are under the influence. And currently there is no policy for the immediate testing of officers. And while it may seem as though this is just a story that I'm sharing, it would really be a little more impactful if I had one of my young men or young women here who could really share a conversation that we've had on the corner of Carpenter and Whittier, or a parent that I've sat in their living room as they've cried, having lost a young person or had a young person assaulted by the police. And so ultimately, what we would like to see is that same level of accountability that we are held to as citizens, because ultimately, police are part of our citizenry. And so yes, absolutely. So the next one is 13. So the Cumberland Division of Police should create a Community Affairs and Relations Bureau with the primary task of establishing, strengthening, and sustaining community relationships and trust. I think that goes to some of the other recommendations that were made earlier, so I won't belabor that. However, I think that one key element of that may be that individuals from this body remain in place, and that we invite other individuals who have been a part of this, either directly or indirectly from the community, so that they might also share their input moving forward. And also, I think that we also have an opportunity to revisit the opportunity to partner with institutions of higher learning, experts from Ohio State, additional experts from Franklin University.
And I'll add to all of our recommendations in the actual recommendation document that nothing that we have recommended is outlandish and it hasn't been done before. All of this is best practice that's been implemented and is currently being done by other comparably sized law enforcement agencies across the country. So one of the other things last thing that we did, because, I kind of look at this holistically, right? So we can make all these recommendations in the world, but if we don't address the contract, all of our work is basically futile. And so we added a couple of items in our recommendations that specifically address the contract between the City of Columbus and the FOP. I think a lot of the situations that we see, a lot of the tension between police-community relationships, a lot of that stems from the contract, which allows certain provisions to happen. And until that is addressed, I think we're probably going to see. So the example, I have a couple of them up here. So the first one listed is Section 10.6A. of the contract, which stipulates that in order to terminate an officer during his or her probationary period, the public safety director must submit a written report to the Civil Service Commission detailing the officer's unsatisfactory performance. And then that report must be submitted at least 10 calendar days prior to the expiration of the probationary period. So that means if something happens within 4 or 5 days of that expiration, that means that officer's appointment is going to become permanent, regardless of what happened. And so we recommend eliminating that 10 calendar day requirement. And that's the first one. If you go forward into the contract, section 10.7, it allows officers to substitute. They get to substitute up to 120 hours of accrued leave for suspensions resulting from corrected or disciplinary action. So in other words, if there is a situation and an officer is suspended for, 24 hours, and they have accrued that in their sick leave, all they have to do is substitute. They can take that 24 hours out of their accrued time and use that and really never leave the street. And so what we recommend is terminating the leave forfeiture option, because that's what that is called. If you go down to section 10.10b, it allows the written record of reprimands to be removed from a personnel file after 3 years. So that means if there was a situation, use of force issue, discrimination, harassment, anything that was on that officer's record, and let's say we get into year 4 and something happens again, then they can't take into account what happened the 3 years prior, because that has been removed. And so we recommend the length of time be changed from 3 years to the duration of employment with the Columbus Division of Police. I'm sure many of you all have personnel files that you can go and look and dig back and see everything that you've done since the very first year that you've been hired on your respective jobs. And so I really think that needs to be addressed. Moving on, section 10.10c, it allows the record of leave in lieu of suspension to be removed after 6 years from the date of incident. So similar to the other one, we also recommend that this length of time as well be changed from 6 years to the duration of employment. And then lastly, section 10.10g, it allows the entries and records of investigations resulting from counseling, documented constructive counseling, written reprimands, or complaints, any of that that were not sustained, to be removed after 3 years. And similar to the other ones, we recommend that be changed, the length of time be changed to the duration of employment. So I think in looking at the contract recommendations and the overall recommendations, one of the things that the contract does sometimes is it gives, I think, sometimes a pass, right? Because there is an understanding that if I do this, then I know the contract is going to cover me or cover the behavior. And so what we want, we want good police officers. We know many police officers do their jobs, and we want to remove even the appearance that, they can take advantage of that contract or the language that's in it to, disregard or disrupt any type of trust and respect that could potentially, the community that could have for them. And so we think that it's important that, we address the contracts, but also the recommendations that we have. And that's all that we have for our presentation. Did you all have anything else? All right.
Thank you. And finally, Vlad Kogan on hot topics.
All right, well, thank you. I hope to leave some extra time at the end. One thing, so I want to thank my committee members who are here, especially Tiffany and Tammy. One thing that we didn't have a chance to do is meet yet to discuss the matrix report. So the recommendations I'm going to give you Some of them may echo what was in the matrix report, and that was in cases where we came to the same conclusion independently. And I think one thing that I did want to flag for the whole commission that maybe is worth talking about if we have time is in the whole matrix report and a variety of recommendations really dealt with this question of seniority versus merit in terms of how assignments are done, in terms of rotational models, in terms of what positions require exceptional qualifications. And so I think that is not something that we're yet, I feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the committee for, but I think that is an area where we as a commission can really weigh in to articulate, I think, the sense of the community about what kind of police department we'd like. And certainly we can't obligate the mayor to negotiate for any particular provisions. We can't obligate the FOP, but I think having a record that comes from our commission would be helpful if there is, during the next collective bargaining cycle, if there's something that goes to the conciliators or the arbitrators, having the sense of the community as represented by us of what kind of police department we want, I think would help weigh in that conversation. So again, that's not going to be in my presentation today, but hopefully we can talk about some of those recommendations from the matrix report specifically. So with that said, so I want to talk about a couple of areas that we discussed. Some of these will echo recommendations from some of the other committees. Some of them will be the same with a little bit more detail, and some will be similar but a little bit different. So what we spent a lot of time on is thinking about how to investigate uses of force and other allegations against officers, the early warning system that we use and improvements that can be made to it, echoing, I think, the last committee's issues of software and outdated IT infrastructure in general, and the cost of that in terms of officer time, public engagement, training, how to evaluate what the department is doing, and then we have some just kind of miscellaneous recommendations. I have to say, when I was printing my notes today, I noticed that somehow I deleted the slide on training, so that's not going to be on your TV, but when I get to it, I'll summarize what we said. It's going to be echoing a lot of the recommendations from the other committees. All right, so I think some of our most important recommendation, and I want to make sure that I'm really clear about explaining it, is with investigations. And our recommendation is that we should have a process for independent investigations involving officers' uses of force to determine whether those were within policy, but also investigations involving complaints against officers. And so we have, I think, some specific principles, and I'll talk about these in a second, but we think it should be an independent process, an independent entity overseeing this process. It should be professionally staffed, so not us, not volunteers off the street, but professionals that have credibility, that have experience. And it should be a public-facing entity that releases information to the public, that has a website that has an office where people can go. And so I think the model that we have in mind is something like an inspector general or an internal auditor that really has the ability to participate fully in every step of either a criminal investigation or an administrative investigation. Not necessarily leading that investigation, but just being there where witnesses are interviewed, being there and weighing in if they think that something inappropriate is happening. So what we're not recommending necessarily is that we get rid of internal affairs and just do this instead. So we see this as kind of complementing the current process that we have. And I want to make clear that this is not in any way kind of a judgment call. We're not saying that we don't trust internal affairs. We're not saying that they're not doing their job. We're not necessarily saying that this would even lead to different outcomes. But we are saying that this is necessary to address, I think, one of the issues that we've talked a lot about, which is building community trust. And it seems just really unrealistic to expect people in this community to believe the police department that it's capable of policing itself. Again, whether that belief is true or not, I think this is a central problem, and we think this is a recommendation that would address that problem. And again, it's about addressing perception and ensuring that people have confidence that when there are complaints made, those complaints are handled fairly. And this is also a recommendation that was made by the 21st Century Policing Commission that we heard about. They basically said this is kind of the new standard, that there be independent investigations, that not all investigations be done in-house. So I think our recommendation is entirely consistent with that national report. All right, so I want to clarify, I want to make sure this is clear. What we're proposing is not the same thing as a civilian oversight board. And I think it's important to emphasize that because we're talking about who does the investigations. not necessarily who determines the discipline in cases where there are complaints sustained. And so I think when we look at cities that have oversight boards, they're primarily at the end reviewing the investigatory materials and making judgments. We're talking about where is that information coming from. And so these two recommendations can be done in concert. You can have an independent oversight board and this independent investigatory body, or they could be, I think, separated, right? Even if we don't get an independent board, we can still have an independent investigatory body. So one thing that we spent some time on is looking to see how other places have done it. And I think one thing that really became clear is that it's very easy to do this not well and do it in such a way that it doesn't address the underlying concerns and perceptions and might even exacerbate some of these issues. So I think as we consider this or talk about this, I want to highlight some problems and lessons learned from other jurisdictions. So one thing that we've seen is that in some states that require independent investigations, this often leads to additional delays. It often leads to really lack of clarity about who's in charge. So for example, in some states, a police department will turn to another department to come in and investigate, and then it's not clear who is in charge of the records. If you want to go back and collect records from the previous 10 investigations, if they're all done by different agencies, it's really hard because they're not in a central place. So I think we definitely want to be mindful of timing to make sure that this is done as kind of expeditiously as possible and as transparent. There's, I think, in many states where this is done, it's typically still a law enforcement entity. So it's not Columbus Division of Police, it's maybe the Franklin County Sheriff's Department that comes in. It doesn't necessarily address some of the concerns about conflict of interest and bias, and doesn't necessarily, I think, bring about the benefits of independent investigations that we're certainly focused on. I think one of the issues is just the practicalities and logistics. If there is a use of force and somebody needs to be out on the scene to investigate, if we are relying on BCI in London to come here, that's going to create hours of delays. Witnesses could be gone by then, et cetera. So having a local entity that can respond and be on the scene in a timely way while the evidence is still there, we think is important. And it has to be a politically neutral body. So, one of the concerns, again, is that if it's a state agency that's overseen by an attorney general, and the attorney general happens to be Republican, while the city is a Democratic city, there could be at least a perception that maybe this process is being used to accomplish political goals. So all of these, I think, are important. And I think one of the most important ideas that we want to emphasize is it has to be seen as a fair process, an impartial process, and it has to have legitimacy for the community, but also for the police officers, right? So again, which is, I think, our focus on professionals, right? One thing we want to avoid is police officers being concerned that some random person on the street is going to be second-guessing the decisions that they make. So having trained professionals who have the trust, who have the expertise of all the stakeholders, we think is important. All right, so here are kind of the principles that we think are necessary, the requirements. Again, professional staffing. So these aren't volunteers, these are professionals who have a lot of experience and training to do this. That they are local, so that they're based here in Columbus. They're not coming in from out of town when they're called and something happens. That they can participate fully. Again, not necessarily lead the investigation, but participate fully. So be at the scene, be in the room when interviews are taking place, have access to all the investigatory files, have access to all the body cam footage, have access to all the personnel records, and have the ability to issue independent judgments. If the Internal Affairs Bureau makes a recommendation, we think this entity should have the ability to come out and say, well, we disagree and here's why, and then have somebody respond if necessary. So this is, I think, an issue that other jurisdictions have run into. Denver has something like this, but they don't have the authority to view body cam footage unless the police department allows them. So again, making sure that this entity has the necessary tools, I think, is important. I think doing this well is expensive. And so I think we need to recognize that. So if we want to do it well, we should do it well, and that will cost money. And then I think doing it well also requires having a structure that can really insulate this from having it being seen as just another organ of the police department. So that won't bring about the increase in trust that we're looking for, but also having it not be seen as kind of an organ of maybe the mayor's office or some other political entity that really, so again, having that credibility with all the stakeholders is important. And again, we think it has to be an accessible public-facing agency with a public-facing website So as investigations are done, they're all released automatically on a website where anybody can get them. They're not kind of stored in a room and somebody has to file a records request to get them. So those are all, I think, principles that we'd like to see incorporated into whatever model, if we endorse one, whatever model ultimately emerges. So that's probably the kind of the most controversial, complicated recommendation. We looked at the EAR system, which is the early warning system we use, the employee action review system. And I think the goal for the early warning system is we want to flag potential problems before they become problems. So if we think there's a risk of officers being involved in some sort of situation, we want to flag that. I think the current system does not do this, right? So the current system we have is twice a year, this committee meets and reviews previous 6 months worth of use of force complaints and use of force records, which is problematic, I think, for a couple reasons, because it's really retrospective, and preventing future problems by looking at data from 6 months before, I think, is not a helpful way to potentially flag problems. I think one analogy I heard, not in this context, but I think applies really well here, relying on this to prevent future problems is kind of like trying to drive while looking in the rearview mirror, right? So looking in the rearview mirror doesn't really tell you what's coming up ahead of you on the road. And we know that a lot of the things that lead to issues are really kind of stress or trauma that happens in the short term. And looking to see what happened 6 months ago will not necessarily flag that or predict issues that emerge out of that. So there are, we think, other issues. So focusing only on officers at the highest 5% or highest 10% really doesn't address the context. Having an officer with a single use of force in a beat where there's usually no use of force could be a signal of something going awry. So there are, I think, a lot of models out there, or some models that other departments are using that are prospective, that are kind of in real time, and that use other indicators, not just previous use of force, in terms of predicting future use of force. And so we think we should have a system that incorporates the things that matter. So some of the things that have been found in other departments in terms of good predictors is just attendance, secondary employment, and extra duty hours. We know, again, when people are don't have enough sleep, when they're working a lot, it's going to affect their judgments. The types of dispatch events they've been on recently, and the percent of calls that are officer initiated versus dispatched, those are all, at least in some departments, seem like they're good predictors of problems that emerge eventually. So I think the flip side is, if we have a predictive system, a prospective system that's not based on anything that's happened yet, I think we have to think through about what would happen if you are flagged. And again, it needs to be a constructive and positive intervention, not something that seems like it's punitive or disciplinary, because the last thing we want to do is kind of have officers change their behavior to try to avoid this in unintended ways. So for example, if officer-initiated stops are a predictor of future use of force, one thing we don't want to do is discourage officers from initiating stops to try to avoid being flagged if they think being flagged is something negative. So again, it's a very, I think, delicate issue and has to be considered carefully, but we think it's an important one. So I want to echo the last committee. The IT infrastructure and the software we use is just crazy, quite frankly. So I just have a picture. I think this goes through what Tracy has been talking about. This is the workflow as a patrol officer. This is the various software you have to go through to do various things. Most of the software does not talk to each other. There's a lot of copying and pasting from one system to the next. There's a lot of minimizing windows. And I'm just going to quote, so we got the matrix recommendations, and we had the chief provide his response. And so there was a recommendation from Matrix to revisit the use of Premier One software. And so there was 2 responses from Deputy Chief Becker. Premier One is totally inadequate for active case management. And there's a response from the acting chief who said, the current records management system and the current computer-aided dispatching systems do not speak to each other, and both are wholly inadequate. And they both see, I think, opportunities for increasing efficiency, right? If officers are not spending 4 hours writing reports, that's 4 hours they could be spending doing other stuff that might alleviate the need for more staffing. All right, so we think that all these systems really need to be interoperable, that they need to talk to each other. It seems like a pretty basic minimal requirement that the CAD and the RMS systems actually communicate. And they really need to be designed with officer productivity in mind. We think there should be a position created, either in the division or in public safety, to really oversee all of the digital assets. We think there should be a comprehensive list of all the applications, a list of when they've been updated, and so we can kind of keep track and make updates as necessary. Future software needs to be evaluated based on its ability to be interoperable. So for example, when the city invested in the ShotSpotter, right, that would have been a good opportunity to evaluate, is that a system that can integrate with these existing systems? So I think when we had, as a commission, the meeting on EARS, the lieutenant in charge of EARS said, we're trying to get attendance data, but we can't figure out how to create that report so that we can actually look at attendance data. That seems like a big problem. All right, and we think there should be a comprehensive schedule and upgrade schedule so that, again, as we buy these various products, we actually update them and keep them up to date. And it should be funded separately, not part of the operational budget, because of course, this is probably the first thing that's going to get cut if the chief has the option of, do I cut software updates or do I cut a patrol officer? Probably going to cut the software updates. All right, so public engagement. I'm going to again echo some of what the previous committee said. There's a lot of things that the division at least says is public engagement. We have this huge report of various things that have been done. But there's really, as far as we can tell, no effort to evaluate whether these public engagement activities have the desired effect of, are they increasing trust in the division? Are they making people feel more comfortable with police officers? It's just kind of seems like a purely compliance-driven thing where we need the biggest list possible of the most stuff possible rather than doing the things that we think actually have an impact and evaluating them. So one thing I'd like to see is building on the matrix survey. I have this done regularly, annually, particularly in areas that have the heaviest police presence, to see how opinions towards the police are changing, whether the things that the division is doing is having a positive impact as intended. With one of the problems that we noticed is that a lot of the metrics that the division really focuses on, certainly crime levels, but weapons recovered, et cetera, really none of those have to do with measuring positive community interactions. And certainly if you're not measuring, it's not going to get done. So having metrics incorporated that focus on public engagement. We think there should also be a survey of rank and file officers, asking them to evaluate whether they think the policies that they're following are really consistent with this goal of enhancing community trust. This is a recommendation that's also from the 21st Century Policing Report, I believe. Yes. All right. So this is the part where I'm missing my slide. On the issue of training, we also agreed with the previous committee about extending the probationary period. We think 1 year is just not enough time to get all the training done and allow officers to really have enough experience to evaluate their fitness for the position. If there's more time, we think there could be some better sequencing. So right now we have a lot of in-class and scenario-based training, and then they go and do their field training. We think there could be an opportunity to really take some of the things that are happening in the class now and move it after field training. So a lot of, again, community-focused issues I think will seem less abstract once officers have been on the street and have had actually opportunities to interact with those situations, and we'll probably get more out of that training in that context. But again, that requires having more time after field training. We think that the field training officers, we've seen the forms that they use, and they're really focused on evaluating tactics and evaluating compliance with policy, but there's really no criteria, there's no independent evaluation of just interactions with the community. And if that's something that we as a division value, it seems like recruits should be evaluated on that by the field training officers as well. And again, I want to echo the recommendations about really adding much more history of policing. That was something that we found was really inadequate in the current training materials. There's a history of policing from kind of a policing standpoint. There's not a history of policing from the community standpoint, and particularly from minority communities and African-American communities. It really goes into kind of the history of, the role that police has played in various kind of less than admirable historical events. And so I think that's really essential for officers to know how the community is going to perceive them and the context for the interactions that they're having. And so not having that as part of the training, we think, is just a huge, huge oversight. All right, so the last thing that I'll mention before the miscellaneous recommendations is kind of related to our engagement recommendation. There's really no system for evaluating engagement, but I think more could be done on evaluating strategic initiatives in general. And I'll give you one example, which was the State Safe Streets Initiative, at least I reviewed kind of the evaluation that was done, and it was really, I think, not an evaluation that uses what I would call modern cutting-edge program evaluation methods. One thing that I think that needs to be accounted for is something called regression to the mean. So we know if there is a lot of crime in one neighborhood and we do nothing, there's a good chance that that spike will kind of go away the next year. If there's a lot of crime, we go in and have an intervention and crime goes down. We don't know if it was because of the intervention or just because of this kind of natural ebb and flow. And so there's a variety of, I think, modern day methods for trying to do rigorous program evaluation that address these kinds of issues. But right now, it's not really something that, as far as I can tell, the analysts in the division are really trained in. And I think it's important to also have, again, kind of a rigorous process. So one of the things that we saw in the Safe Streets evaluation is it worked in one of the 3 places, didn't work in the other 2, but there was kind of this rationalization, oh, maybe it didn't work on the south side because they were chasing hotspots, which is plausible, but again, not necessarily kind of the rigorous way in which you'd want to do these evaluations. And so again, overall, I think we want to echo the recommendation that there'd be more cooperation between division and some of the higher learning institutions, particularly on training for analysts and make sure they have the modern skills to apply methods to really help shape policy and strategic initiatives to make sure they're working, and so that if they're not working, we can go back and update them. All right, so the last couple are just random recommendations that are unrelated to anything else. So we think, again, this is from the 21st Century Policing. So as part of the whatever evaluation process is done for officers, I think it's important that there be a kind of intentional effort to evaluate community engagement, separate from all of the other dimensions of performance that's evaluated currently. We'd like to see some more institutionalized collaboration and ongoing learning from the COPS office at the Department of Justice. And when we do, as a division, have officers or leaders attend professional development conferences, that there'd be a better process to make sure that what they learn at these learning opportunities is brought back and shared with everybody else who didn't go to these professional conferences and learning opportunities. So that's all I have. And I'll let the other committee members jump in if I left anything off the list.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you.
As your chair, I just have to say that what I've seen today is amazing. There were times when you just didn't know if things were going to begin, to come together, and certainly there were criticisms that too many times we were just being talked to, but the work of the committees that we've seen here today is just absolutely outstanding. It reflects how much time you spent certainly away from the commission meetings themselves to delve into each of these topics. And so again, thank you. So we've come to the time when we can, as commissioners, ask any of the presenters any follow-up questions or concerns. Again, just looking down the road, again, we have 2 more meetings. October 1st is the public meeting. We'll be hearing from the public again. And then I'm not quite sure of the specific format, but we will be voting on individual recommendations. And one thing I would share with my thoughts, with the commissioners, certainly the mayor does not expect us to come up with this unanimous vote on everything. We need to know that it's okay for each of us as individual commissioners to feel free to vote no or yes. And absolutely, we should not feel that by doing that, we are saying anything negative about the good work of the other commissioners. This has to be an independent thing that you will do. And again, that's that later meeting in October. We value all of the work, but there are 17 of us, and we are not necessarily going to agree in these votes, and we'll kind of work that out in a little bit. But now questions?
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
The first one is for Andrea in the hiring presentation. One of the items you brought up was citizenship requirements. Can you elaborate? I just wasn't sure which either direction you were going with that or the reasoning for it.
Yeah, I'll answer that one. Glad let us know that actually it's currently a requirement that you be a citizen to be a police officer, and our recommendation was that that requirement be eliminated.
What's the reason for that being eliminated?
That shouldn't be something holding somebody back, that, maybe for whatever reason, I think now in our current administration, most people are trying to get their citizenship, but, there was certainly some people who might just want to keep their prior citizenship and not become a U.S. citizen, but they might still want to be a police officer, and that it shouldn't be something that's a roadblock or a barrier for them.
Can I just add this really fast? So I don't think the U.S. military requires you to be a citizen, so it seems kind of odd that the bar be higher for Columbus Division of Police than it is to serve in the military. So I think that was one of the original impetuses why I suggested this to the committee.
Thank you. I disagree, but we're allowed to disagree, so says Chair Jackson. My other question, the 21st century policing, I think, Tracy, you brought it up. It was so we both agreed that we should have more CIT training.
Yes.
We started ours a little lower threshold, saying that every officer should have 8 hours awareness training, and you were saying they should have 40, which I think is great. I agree with that. We were trying to find a middle ground. So I ask a little bit of you and a little bit of the commission, how do we find, we can't make both recommendations, right? Because those will be going against each other. So how do we deconflict? I think that's the only one that may conflict with another one. So how do we as a group decide which one we go with rather than waiting till the vote and voting yes on two?
It's mandatory for all recruits going through the academy now to become CIT officers. So if you think with a matter of attrition and time, all officers on patrol, for instance, in a matter of 10 years, you think of B Company and the amount of time that they have on, will be CIT trained. And so I think that that in-service training, everybody's getting the 40 hours. You get 20 hours in the academy. That comes to everyone on the division has had that, some form of that. And then we have the additional 40 hours, which is now required. So all recruits are becoming CIT certified. So they're all going through that additional 40 hours of training. What the disconnect is the follow-up training. So we have resources that completely shut down, resources that come up that can actually help people, but officers don't know about it. So that's where that in-service training is important. And if it's important for the division, I think that they should then train the officers to better handle that. So as far as having a certain amount of officers that don't have that CI training, they all have a basic level of that training, but there you could certainly have some type of in-service training available for officers that just had aren't actually CIT certified through Connect Role training or something along those lines on how do we different types of de-escalation. So
let me go back to I think your question. This was a particular instance where you saw a conflict in terms of the recommendation. My suggestion would be that before we get to voting, that the two and not the whole committees, but maybe the chairs, you have a conversation to see if you can actually, if there might be some middle ground, and then if not, it comes to a vote, and which one gets the most votes or whatever. But I think it would be helpful. I've heard from many of the committees very similar things, and where you see a conflict, if the chairs can reach out and just have a conversation and maybe come up with another recommendation. I have a question for, yes.
Before we move on, I just want to say I don't think it's not finding a middle ground. I think we're overlapping, which is a good thing. If y'all want to meet after, I think I'm speaking a little bit for us, but we'd be willing to withdraw ours since yours covers it. But we can talk after. Cool. Thank you.
That's a great one, too. Vlad, I have one for you, and it was on your very first point, the independent investigations. And towards the end, you said something that kind of raised some concern. So let's say that there's an investigation. Internal Affairs comes to one conclusion. The independent investigator comes to another. My question is, how do you reconcile it?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and I'll let my fellow committee members maybe chime in as well. But so from what, I think the model that we are most familiar with is in Denver, and the conclusions were, I think, less about, the outcome and more about the investigation, right? If Internal Affairs says this is how we reached our conclusion, we think there was no discipline, that there was no infraction, the independent body comes out and says, well, we think that they're not putting enough weight on the testimony from this witness, or we don't think that they did a good job interviewing this witness. And that creates kind of an expectation that Internal Affairs respond. And from my understanding, really, the primary benefit of this body is kind of shining a light and creating expectation of response. Transparency.
To the
correct.
investigation, so
Correct.
through the website and
Correct.
everything else.
Correct.
The transparency.
But I'll let everybody else.
Of repairing trust and legitimacy. And so Denver has done a unique job of implementing those pillars, which leads me to the question that I was going to ask, and I think it just adds to this conversation, is have we decided as a body that we want to implement in this city all 7 pillars? Last meeting, Chair Jackson, you weren't in attendance, but Acting Chief Quinlan did a presentation that broke down how much of the report, and he touched a little bit on the pillars of 21st century policing, but we never got to, and we must, what we believe is a body. What is our ultimate goal? What are we marching toward? We will come forth with these recommendations as this group. But also, we got a whole presentation last commission meeting of what the chief has already begun to implement. And we have to begin to merge those things. Right now, we're double working. And let me slow down enough to say thank you to all of us that have done this work with good intentions to get to the outcomes we seek. But if we don't bring these things together in one space, I raised the question last meeting to Acting Chief Quinlan, what led him to begin to implement ahead of these reports coming out? And I have to go back and look at his answer because I'm still not clear, but he saw the need, is what I took from what he said. We see the need, and that's why we're in these rooms for this long. And so we've got to decide, one, each person that presented today spoke from 21st century policing. But we haven't said that we adapt the 7 pillars as this body.
No, we have not.
Okay, and so we're getting ahead of ourselves. We cannot get up and present all these beautiful, and no disrespect to every presentation, unless we are saying as this body, we all are moving towards implementing all 7, 2, 1. I'm not sure on, I'm sorry,
We
6
had a-
pillars. I'm sorry, 6, I keep saying 7, maybe there's a 7 somewhere. But that's where I stay stuck in this, and I've heard this conversation, we've talked, some of us one-on-one about it. But I think that we need to think about that, and maybe that's us, the committee people coming together, or us saying, because these recommendations will come out, but I think that we have, and these are recorded publicly, we keep speaking about this amazing report that I don't know if all the public is aware what's in it. I don't know if we are saying to the public, because we are speaking from it, that we agree with everything, but I clearly heard the chief say that there was a vote. I think there was, in the Matrix report, 57% of some things that they agreed with. What was it, 43% for those who were in the meeting last meeting that they did not? And so we need to understand that a little more clearly before we get to some final report.
Well, I would remind you, and of course you know, we had a very specific subcommittee to look at the issue of 21st century policing. That subcommittee, which is so ably led by Dr. Jones, is bringing the recommendations that were connected to 21st century that committee believes we should vote on. Now, there was never an issue that we could, I think very early on when we were meeting, we were sent the entire report on the 21st century policing, but there was never a question raised, or in my mind, an expectation that it was our role as a commission just to say to the mayor, we just want to vote to adopt the 21st century policing report, the 6 pillars, and going forward. We were to take from it what we felt was very important for this city. And so I do not anticipate that there will be such a vote. And with all due respect to Chief Quinlan, I'm thrilled that he's moving forward with making suggestions. And where we may overlap with what he's already doing, it simply makes a stronger case for whether it's Chief Quinlan or the future chief to use whatever those suggestions are, because you're coming from 2 different bodies, but in essence saying, sort of the same things. But on your point around some things maybe being in conflict, and I think this goes back to maybe it's hiring. It seemed there were a couple of suggestions around moving certain functions from the police department. One was around EEO complaints, and another one was around some type of investigations. So this is what I wanted to ask. I thought, and again, this is something that has already occurred, that the mayor and the safety director made a decision to hire an additional deputy in the safety director's office, and moving several of those things from the police department to actually the director of public safety. And I'm wondering if that hasn't already occurred. Did you address that when you?
I think if I'm remembering correctly, and my fellow commission members helped me with this, we looked at the table of organization that Chief Quinlan circulated to us at that meeting. And the recommendations that we made was to move from the one division recruiting to the division that actually had more HR community-focused missions, because we saw perhaps that the recruiting unit would get lost in the administrative, bureaucratic types of topics, whereas if they, because there's a certain silo effect that we sensed as well. So if the recruiting unit was with the unit that deals with human resources, community building, relationship building, then they could also obtain the resources. So that's the specific move that we made for that. Public accountability subdivision, placing it under community services subdivision.
Around EEO complaints?
Yes.
And I think that's the one, and we'll just have to, I'll have to look into it to see if in fact it has already been moved.
Yeah, because again, we took into consideration.
I'm sorry, yes. Pardon?
We do have someone on board. She's been on board for about a month and a half now.
And so, and again, am I correct that specifically on the EEO investigations, they've been moved from the police department to the office of the safety director, and it might even just be helpful if there was a job description for that person to share it with the commission, just so, because this, again, to the point that they've been moving parts, and maybe the commission wasn't aware of everything that was going on, whether it was in the safety director's office or the chief's. This would maybe help us understand better, because in a way, this was a, for the ministers who met with the mayor, who made several demands or requests, this was a direct response, this one thing that I'm talking about, to that meeting. And so we'll just get us informed. Other questions? Yes.
And what I'll say to that is I imagine that a lot of this will either have already been addressed in practice, or at least some measure of this work will have been addressed in some form or function, but I think that it's still true that the recommendation should be made, right? So even if things have transpired since we came together as a body, the recommendations should be memorialized in some way, shape, or form from our body. But the question I had was for the training subcommittee, and one of the general recommendations was to expand the pool of trainers to include subject matter experts, civilian instructors. And while I agree that that's something that should happen, the one thing that I wanted to ask about, or even recommend rewording, is that adding or expanding the pool of trainers could do the same damage from a single perspective as having police officers train police officers. And so one of the things that I was curious about is, was there any discussion about co-created content where that expertise can live alongside one another? Meaning, as we're developing new content for training, we have the perspective of police and the perspective of an expert, so that when it's being delivered in a training, you understand all of the nuance that lives inside of the training material, and those things can play out in discussion and in training. Was that discussed?
So while we didn't get into the specifics of how content would then be creative, some of the examples and the citations, for instance, with the juvenile justice piece, we pointed to, just like the Schubert Center, Gabriella Celeste from the Schubert Center came into that presentation with us. Her presentation has been adapted by and kind of taken to other police departments for the purpose of integrating it with kind of what they already learned. So we talk about adding to, and for those who haven't seen what the curriculum look like, each module of curricula has subject matter experts listed who helped pen the training. So, for instance, people in this room are part of the subject matter experts from the police department or city attorney or attorney general listed as the content providers. And so what we suggested is adding in professionals there. So I think while we haven't had a discussion on what exactly would that look like, I think it presumes that by adding those people to that group of people who create the curriculum, that they're going to be doing it in concert with one another, because I don't know that, and that's part of what our suggestion about making sure the content actually starts to mesh together, because one of our critiques was also that having everything kind of separate and the left hand isn't looking at the right means that there's content crossover that's being missed. So, I mean, we can definitely get, I think, probably more specific with that, but we didn't exactly say, and this is how the content should be created.
Yeah,
I think one thing that I had the exact same question, because somebody that we spoke to made the comment, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe there's some backfiring. For example, bringing somebody in from Kerwin to talk about implicit bias, if then perhaps it would be more powerful if it were coming from a fellow officer, because it's just too much sort of like this outsider feeling. So I think, yeah, that sort of having the Kerwin Institute person and then a fellow officer then makes the training a bit more powerful, and then there's more buy-in from fellow officers if they're hearing it from an officer.
I think there's validity to that. One thing, we didn't go as in-depth as we could on some of the explanations, but one of the examples we talked about was juvenile justice, the procedural aspect. So bringing in those folks we wouldn't expect a psychologist to talk about juvenile justice procedural law, but to be able to, like I said, to integrate these throughout. Another example we talked about was in domestic violence. It's very procedural, but it doesn't talk about human trafficking. It doesn't talk about the psychology of domestic abuse and assault. So if there's a way to merge those, I don't think that our recommendation is at all focused on replacing law enforcement. When I said law enforcement would be biased, I agree. The other side may be biased the other way. It's an integration of those together. And if we need to or it's recommended, we can expand this, I think. We didn't want to write a whole entire book on something and then find out it's not going to make it in the cut. So we're happy to add whatever needs to.
Several things. One, the subject matter experts are not experts sometimes on different topics. I happen to think that not everybody can teach implicit bias, and so just having somebody go through a couple of weeks training and now they're an expert in teaching is a mistake. So we wouldn't have everybody teach CIT, so we should look at certain topics differently than the ones that we've historically taught. But my question that I had before this subject came up was in Andrea's presentation about youth, training or recruiting youth. We heard a presentation by the recruitment staff last year on when I asked a question about whether or not they go to schools, even in primary school, to inform kids about the profession of law enforcement, and they said they were working on doing that. They were already doing middle school or some other programs. So that led me to think that there are things that are already promising practices that exist in the Columbus Division of Police that our recommendations are building upon, not creating something brand new. So to the point where where what we're doing is recommending that they improve or modify something that they're already doing. I think we should acknowledge the fact that this isn't something brand new for the Columbus Division of Police, but we're recommending how to improve it in some instances rather than it being a brand new recommendation. So I happen to think, and when we've heard presentations about the Columbus Division of Police, even though we can point to things that we know we want to suggest that they do differently, we can also point to, as it compares, and this is something Matrix highlighted a lot, that the Columbus Division of Police is already a good police department. So how do we, make sure that we, properly recognize that when we're doing our recommendations? I don't want to look like that, when we make our recommendations, that somehow or another this is nirvana for, in terms of the recommendation, when it's actually something that they were either thinking about doing, but maybe can improve upon.
Thank you. Yes, Vlad.
So I have two quick questions for the training subcommittee, just to get kind of a little bit more clarity on the rationale. So, and one of the recommendations I think was also from hiring about drug and alcohol testing in the case of critical incidents. And I think one thing that makes me a little bit uncomfortable is it has a little bit of a kind of a gotcha feel to it. If our concern is that officers are under the influence and they are involved in critical incidents that they would not have been had they not been under the influence, it seems like the solution would be testing for everybody, random testing, and then referral to substance abuse programs beforehand, rather than waiting until after a critical incident and only testing that subset of people. So I'd like to hear more about why not just test everybody randomly and have it not feel so punitive, have it be designed to, again, try to prevent problems. And then the second question is about the good faith clause. I'd like to know how that kind of overlaps or doesn't, I think, with the current language about the expectation that you engage in conduct becoming of an officer and that be grounds for discipline. It's not obvious to me kind of what this adds that regulations or rules don't already cover. So thank you.
I'll speak briefly to the question about testing, because we had a discussion about this as well in our subcommittee. The reality is that random testing isn't always random. And so if it is, or I feel, as a person of color who has been subjected to random screens more so than counterparts of mine who don't share my race, that there is there's an aspect of that loses its integrity, or it has the ability to. And other commissioners, feel free to weigh in, but I think that's why it's good after an event, and I'm not saying it's good to let something happen and then wait till afterwards, but I don't know that random testing is the best way to do that. It's expensive. So
I think the other part to it that you mentioned, Bud, the drug testing, is I don't want to wait until something happens, or I just test. But if a community member, a friend, a neighbor, a loved one is killed by the police at the extreme of use of force, I would want them drug tested immediately to make sure that hopefully they were not using anything or under the influence. So I think if there's a use of force, and we wrote it as, we said following use of force incident, and then we focused on deadly force. I think maybe it was the hiring committee, you guys said critical incident. We talked about that too, and I don't know, I agree with critical incident. I don't know where that ends or starts, because if it's every single use of force, then it would be ridiculously expensive. And all day long, police officers would be going to the property room, writing a report, getting drug tested, and then they wouldn't be answering any calls. So I don't know if you guys want to weigh in more on how you figured out the critical incident aspect, because we struggled a little bit, honestly, with where does it fall.
Did you define it?
I don't think we defined it in a true scope, but when you're looking at a loss of life, I think that was absolutely an incident that we would consider worthy to be drug tested. I can tell you, Vlad, where I'm working now, when an employee gets involved in a car accident while they're on work hours, it is an automatic drug and alcohol testing that they have to pursue before they can come back to duty. So there are models out there that's not a gotcha. It's a term and condition of our employment that we just know if this happens, then this is the protocol that we have to do.
My sense is that those policies in place like target or in place really for like liability reasons. We test so that we don't get sued. which is, I think, not necessarily kind of the compliance room model that we necessarily, I think, want to bring here. So I'm not opposed to it, but I would really like to see it be much more preventative rather than just after the fact. Yeah.
You want to go first? Okay, thank you. Vlad, I think that when we're talking about, and still in the scope of 21st century policing, restoring trust and legitimacy, and you're talking about loss of life. And so many things, and media being access to information, people frame narratives from one sentence that is released. And the more that we can restore credibility and trust, I think especially, and there has to be some guidelines. I'm sure it would be expensive every time we turn around, we're sending our officer to be drug tested. But in the case of loss of life, and Columbus has experienced several high-profile shootings at the hands of police and loss of life, I think that as a city to be able to say that these procedures or this policy is in place, I think it gets us to that outcome of that first pillar. And so, I don't want to be a punitive, I want to be a restorative thinking person in this also. But if we can get to restoring some trust and say in these particular cases when we've lost a citizen, that we've decided as a committee or a city that we want to take it an extra step, so that I've watched so many stories just jump ahead of itself with one news article, and I know all of us have. But the more that we can restore credibility in our process, I think that we get to an outcome we see.
And since that was our 12th recommendation, I'd also like to chime in and just say really quickly that random is effective if I'm not in cahoots with you. If I have a team that I believe in because of our history or my belief in their performance or whatever our relationship is, then I can say to Matthew, you got a drug test next week. So go down to Cloud 9 or get your son's urine and be clean when you go. However, because you can't plan to take a life, 24 hours after that, or within that time frame, you need to be able to produce. And so, of course, there is still room for prep, but it's far less than that which would be available to you in the event that I, as your upline or your superior officer, could provide to you if I like you.
The other part that you asked about was the morality clause, the good faith oath. So I forget what you had mentioned or referenced, the oath officers take or the conduct
becoming of an officer, yeah.
So I don't think it's clear enough, honestly. I don't think it's detailed enough. So when it says, you'll protect citizens, you'll protect people, you'll defend the Constitution, the morality clause goes far deeper. We specifically put in our notes here the denunciation of any cultural supremacist group, the equal protection to all citizens, calling out race, class, creed. It puts a little bit more saying that I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to provide a moral service. I think a lot of officers will take the oath and say, yeah, I'm willing to defend the Constitution. But let's be honest, the Constitution was written where not all people are equal. So when you really look at what it is and what a current morality clause is, it's just like the drug testing, right? It says that it's a higher level of accountability for police officers, and it might even be as much, in my opinion, as someone reading that and feeling less comfortable signing it or less comfortable going that way, or holding them to a higher accountability when they're involved in something, hopefully not in Columbus, but like we've seen in other cities and states, police officers are members of the KKK, openly and secretly, and this would stop that from happening. This would, any officers who are already on board would have to sign this. It now says, hey, if we've determined that that's the case, you signed a morality clause, which is more than just conduct unbecoming. It just gives an extra level of protection, and honestly, I think an extra level of, I'm not sure the term, but buy-in or commitment to the citizens. That's the approach. That's my opinion. Anyone on the subcommittee, please jump in.
I'm not talking about the oath. My understanding is that the rules and regulations that the chief puts out, right, that are grounds for discipline for violation. I guess I was curious more about that and what's already in there that overlaps or doesn't. So I think just getting a little bit more information from the department about what's already in the existing rules and regulations that speak to this, and maybe what's missing from there would be helpful for me to kind of get a sense of what problems to solving.
If it helps, I think it's the, kind of what you're saying on the drug testing thing, it's the proactive. Instead of joining the department and
Right.
saying, here, I will follow these rules, this is saying, I'm going to join the department, I'm committing to
Right. Which
more
makes
than
a lot of
just.
sense to me.
Because being
Makes a lot of
racist
sense,
isn't
yeah.
illegal necessarily, acting on that is. And this is saying, I won't do anything explicitly biased that would harm somebody else.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Other questions? Excuse me.
I have a question just to, I think this was the training subcommittee, just to further define the felony murder statute recommendation that you have. I didn't fully understand that.
So the way that, I'll just explain how it works, and then Matthew, if you want to chime in. The way that felony murder statutes work is that you can be, let's say that you're with buddies, and your buddy, during the commission of a robbery, right? And you might not necessarily be the person who has the weapon, but during the robbery, someone dies. Even that if that's not the object or the intention or the mens rea of the offense, and you can then be charged with murder during the commission of a felony. And so the example that Matthew gave was a young girl who's currently being held in Franklin County Detention who was with her boyfriend during an arranged drug buy, and the boyfriend ended up dying, right? It was the boyfriend who died. He was shot and killed by police. The girl is now being held for murder. So the way that felony murder works is, in basic terms, commission of a different felony, being held responsible for a homicide.
It's a state statute.
And it is a state statute. So it is in Ohio is one of the few states that still hold someone responsible like that for a homicide, even if they are not the person who actually committed the offense.
So it came up at one of the public hearing meetings we had, or the public hearing meeting that we had, and when that was brought up, I completely agreed. I don't think we should have that. I do want to clarify, so the additional recommendations that we have, the 7, even though some of these are, actually a number of these were agreed upon by multiple subcommittees, some of these fall outside of our scope a little bit, I admit. I think it's our duty, if voted on and agreed, that we do include these in the report, even though if there's a note that says they're outside of the scope or whatever, the commission feels these are relevantly strong enough to serve justice to the community. So there's not a lot of explanation on there, and it would require a legislative change, but I think we should recommend to the mayor to work with folks to make that change.
So that brings the point up of what might be issues that we can get feedback on that might even be a bargaining issue, instead of, something you talk about outside of scope. I don't know. I'm not sure if you would have to bargain whether or not you drug test a person for something that's currently not, in, the rules and regulations of the department, of the division. So, there may very well be issues that come up that surface that the FOP will say this has to be bargained.
Well, I'm sure there are going to be quite a few.
Yeah.
Both with Matrix and ours, so. But I still think we should go forward with.
Well, I do too.
Should go forward with the
My question was
recommendations.
whether or not we will get feedback on what those
Okay.
ones are.
And are you saying feedback from the department or feedback from the
Whoever, I think
mayor?
once we synthesize our recommendations, and I'm not sure if they're going to be ultimately merged with matrices or not. Or
No,
two-
they will stand as 2 separate reports.
So 2 separate reports. So however that feedback process will be, on both reports, I think would be, helpful.
So what would the purpose of the feedback be?
Well, to find out where what, are they going to eliminate these recommendations because it has to be bargained, or they're going to pursue bargaining? They're not going to pursue bargaining on some of these issues in terms of what's the disposition of these recommendations based on whether it's out of control currently of this commission or the Matrix report.
So perhaps this is a point of clarification, but
Give it microphone, please, just so you can be recorded.
So this is a point of clarification because I thought we were putting forth the recommendations and basically it's, then up to them to decide what they can move forward with and what not. I didn't think that that other piece of that, I don't really think it matters whether or not.
Well, I think it matters that we get feedback, even though this commission may not be meeting like we are now. I think as a.
I'm talking about in terms of so if we get the feedback, then that's not going to change. I'm trying to figure out what's the purpose because it's not going to really change the recommendations, is it? Or what?
I don't, were you going to respond?
ahead.
I'm sorry. For some, and I know each one of us has an interest in doing this work, not just Matrix, but the mayor, but the city. There's so much at stake here. And so this commission was formed at a height of not only the mayor's office, but the city and people of Columbus, all of us citizens, saying that we wanted to shift to something. Is how I came into this commission.
Right.
And so, I am very happy that Chief Quinlan has taken a leap ahead
Yeah,
and
he's
started
done a lot.
I'm sorry?
I said, yeah, he's done a lot.
Been proactive, thank you
Yes.
for the word. Been proactive in trying to implement, and that's a huge step. And everything that I think about, because most of what I hear is restoring credibility and legitimacy in the community. And so each time we can say these things are happening, it gets us a little bit closer to that outcome. And the city people want to know, what are we doing? They know that we have been meeting this long. The report came with a big glossy press conference that people have interpreted some way or the other. And so if we're going to get to calming the public on this subject, or restoring trust and legitimacy, however you want to look at it, we have to be saying this is what we're doing. Actually, I feel like the report that was given to us from Chief Quinlan needs to be public. People need to know that as of July 14, 2019, these new things are in place. Now, whether they're effective or not, we have no control over, or if it's the end-all, be-all, I don't know. But at least someone took a step. And I think that's important, not meaning that it helps us continue to keep on meeting, because I know none of us have the time to keep on meeting, but it will let the public know that something is happening, and they can decide whether or not they choose to follow those roads wherever they lead.
Excuse me, let me try to clarify what I hear around the feedback. It's not feedback before we issue our report. That's not, no, it is, and I think that was it. It's not feedback. It's not feedback before we vote and issue our report. I think
I
it
don't understand responding to something I said or
No.
No,
It was what started this, feedback.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was feedback. And then Dr. Jones questioning it. So I think it's just, and you're saying yes. So I think she was thinking that the request was for feedback before we finished our work.
Yeah,
so let me
I-
just share this with you. I do not know, after we submit our report, Mayor and I have not talked about, what goes on after. I mean, he has said, I don't know if he's called it an oversight, committee. How is it actually going to be implemented? I don't know those things. I've heard him say this is not going to be a report that sits on a shelf, but what are those steps? As chair of the commission, I don't know what they are. And I don't know if the city, as in the public safety director and the mayor and others, but your point is valid. We've done all of this work, and so I don't know if there will be touch points with us for a year or whatever. Just saying to the commission, we heard you, these are the things that we're doing, because I think all of us would be very, very interested in what the follow-up is going to be. And I think that's what you were asking for.
It's exactly what I was asking. And just to give an example, I chaired a committee for the Attorney General, and after the committee was sunsetted, the Attorney General was respectful enough to give feedback on each one of the recommendations to that committee for a couple of years after that committee had been sunsetted in terms of its meetings. So, we can actually add a recommendation that, give feedback to this commission that's, been doing this work for probably 2 years when all is said and done. And I think that would only be just a respectful thing to do for the people who've made this kind of a sacrifice.
If I can reiterate, Dr. Jones, just to clarify, I think what you're saying, our recommendations, whatever the roadblocks are, don't matter. We're going to put it in there, and if it's an FOP contract, change, it doesn't matter to us. We're making the recommendation and they can figure it out. Okay.
Can I just echo that? I think it's particularly important, right, because this is our opportunity to potentially shape the future collective bargaining. So that's particularly important for us to lay this out, to create kind of a expectation that this is what we're looking for as a community, because I think it'll be helpful down the road for having these changes be realized.
Yes, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? I know I think 3 of the 4 subcommittees recommended extending the probationary period, and that wasn't something that our particular subcommittee looked into. Can somebody just explain to me really quickly what are the barriers for that? What would have to happen for that to change?
So my understanding is that it would require a amendment to the city charter, which would require a public referendum.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm glad you brought that up, though. So I counted up, as people were going through, we have 9 recommendations that at least 2, if not 3, or all 4 subcommittees reported out on. I won't read all of them, but drug testing was brought up, review board, probation, diversity of ABCs in policing. So are we going to have an opportunity before we vote to make sure where there's overlap that those are appropriately combined? For example, who brought up, was it 21st Century, was that you, Dr. Jones, that brought up diversity in ABCs? Yes. So yours and ours are saying the same, but they're worded different. We need to make sure that all of us are getting together, that it's one recommendation since it's cumulative rather than.
Yeah, we can talk and get all the committees together, well, chairs or whatnot, and we can reword that, yeah.
Okay.
I think we will also be using the support from the city as a, when Adam sent out the sort of the spreadsheet, but also to go through and Brian to see and collapse them into one and make that note that they came from certain committees. Yes, he just stepped out.
Or just about. Since he's not in here, I'll give him some work. I'd be happy to give him all 9 of these that were overlapping and from who, so that he knows which ones he can combine for us.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I'll defer and then I'll come back.
Will we get all the committee's recommendations together so that we can review them? I know we've got a couple handouts, and there was a couple of presentations. I don't think there were, or 1 or 2 that
I
wasn't.
think you should have received prior to today. I don't think they just came to me, but I'd have to ask. When each subcommittee sent their recommendations to Brian, did Brian send them to all members of the commission?
No, we don't have them.
Okay, so there's a narrative where that can be done. And then I think immediately, we should be able to have the PowerPoints sent to each commission. So pardon?
I've already got them, so, yeah.
Okay, but there are, you remember when you submitted your reports, and I think they followed, as I was trying to follow along with your report and the presentation today, they were very carefully aligned. So that information will get out to you. Okay.
And will there be, just one quick, a follow-up, revised timeline? Because at this point, I think a lot of us are confused about the next couple of months in the timeline and scheduling.
It's not a couple of months, not from my perspective right now. October the 1st.
It's been a couple of months.
No, I'm talking about just
I'm
now,
referring
what I
to.
shared earlier at the very beginning of the meeting. October the 1st is our next meeting. That's the public meeting, and I believe the location is the Jerry Hammond Center. And then the vote is October 22nd, and on that, let me say that I need to meet with probably, even though Brian is on leave, I still have access to him as to how we're going to logistically do that. Okay, so, but it's the vote, October 22nd. That's the one where we just ask every commission member to please be in attendance, please be timely, because that's maybe our most important meeting.
There's no other.
What will the public be responding to?
We will have presentations for them. Okay, we'll do follow-up.
So you want them to respond to a presentation that they have received in the very moment they're to respond to it?
We will provide information. As I sit here right now, I can't tell you exactly what form it's going to be in. I'll have those discussions with the folks that are supporting us, and we'll get information out. But I cannot tell you, because I don't know exactly what it's going to look like.
Well, I guess I would just have to voice a concern that someone is expected to respond to something that they literally just received. It doesn't make
Thank you.
good response.
Thank you. Yes.
Calendar vote that I have for the 22nd from 1 to 7.
Yes.
That's the final vote?
Yes.
Okay,
From
just
1
want to
to
make
7.
sure. Okay.
I think you were asked to hold between 1
1 to
PM and
7.
7 PM. Did you have a question?
I did, it's a question, but it's also just a public caution for us as commissioners, and it's really about the unintended consequence of some of our recommendations, and us being intentionally thoughtful about what we want to get out of some of these recommendations, because without the benefit or virtue of being able to play out if and then scenarios, there's recommendations that are concerning. So, for example, one of the recommendations is that written reprimands remain in someone's personal profile for the duration of their career. And what I would say is that the unintended consequence is that a mistake becomes a life sentence. And what disproportionality tells me is that if you don't solve for cultural competency, there can be an overrepresentation of officers of color who are being reprimanded unfairly, and that become part of their permanent personnel file. And so I would say that unless we're willing to have the conversation about bias and corrective action for those with whom you don't share identity, I would say we need to be careful about putting something like this going into someone's personal file for the rest of their career.
Do you have a recommendation, Sean, of a time frame or a better, I don't say a better, a different recommendation than the two that we offered?
It can be longer than 3, but certainly I don't know that it needs to be for the duration of their employment. And maybe we have a conversation at our final vote or sometime in between now and then around what others are doing. But I don't know that because what it makes me think about is this whole idea of mass incarceration and mass supervision where people's mistakes stay with them forever. And what I'm saying is that I don't know that if swinging the pendulum the entire other direction is the same outcome that we want, because we're trying to dismantle that on the other side.
If I may, I agree with that, and I think that's insightful for you to share that. However, I think that it goes to loss of life, where we know that individuals of color are overrepresented on the loss side. And so in those specific incidences, I think those incidences have to remain in your file.
So we should say that specifically.
Yes, specifically, because critical incidences, although not defined, not to jump on your committee, Chair Morbitzer, but clearly defining that loss of life piece, because I think that the pattern has the potential of developing, and then we're ignorant to it in the absence of these documents, potentially.
Right. I agree with you in terms of loss of life or certain thresholds being introduced, but I don't want this to end up in a space where the trivial becomes part of someone's permanent record. Insubordination, things of that nature that we know can be very subjective.
Absolutely. So if I may quickly, I had a couple questions. Oh, absolutely. No.
So just a notion about that, and then I'm hearkening back to our chair's comment, and not necessarily because Sean brought this up, because I mean, we may not want to agree on what everything that somebody disagrees or agrees about. So at some point, I think we make our point, and then when we begin to vote on these issues, then we can either vote up or vote down what the recommendations from the committees are.
I agree with you, but I absolutely agree with you, but I think that Sean has probably brought up a point that maybe the committee didn't take into consideration. I don't know if you actually thought about kind of the unintended consequences. And so maybe a good idea would be to take a look. Did you survey other communities to see?
No, that was our committee.
Was yours? So, but
yeah,
again, if
we looked at other communities, but we're definitely open, to, if you have suggestions for modifying the language, like these are, it's a draft. And so, that's why we're here, to discuss it, to get feedback, and, we can fine tune it. So, if we need to modify the language, add something, change the length of time, like whatever, we're completely open to it.
Yeah.
So what I assume is going to happen on the 22nd when we vote is it's going to be a yes or no. Will we get an opportunity when these come together for that reason to review these and say, well, you said 5 years, maybe we should say 7 or 3, to adjust it before the vote, so that we're not there saying yes, but, like, will we have that opportunity? We have a month or so.
Or even if, when we have a lot of hours set aside, even if it comes down to the day of the vote, October 22nd, from my perspective, this isn't like a ballot.
Okay.
And some of that negotiation could even take place,
Okay.
in the meetings. It'd be almost like an amendment, to. We want to have the opportunity, if you can do it beforehand, but if not, that's how I'm thinking about this. And let me, even though we're not quite ready to adjourn, and I'm not sure who I'm seeing from the city. I don't see, well, it would either be Denise or Adam.
Adam's back there.
Is Adam? Oh, there you are. I will ask Adam for the city to use all efforts to publicize our public meeting on October the 1st. And that should include a reminder to citizens that they have access, I'm assuming this will be up the way it's been before, to look at this meeting on government access television. The recommendations were there. You heard comment, you can hear debate. I am not willing to take draft information and to have it out. But this is a good way, you ask a good question, and spread the word, let people know. Today was a very thorough, I think, discussion. And if citizens have a real interest in this, then they can take the time to look at the 2 or 3 hour presentation.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yes.
According to my calendar, that event is 2 weeks from tomorrow, and I haven't seen anything out there yet. So
That's
I'm
why-
hoping that that's coming soon.
That's why I'm asking
Yeah.
Adam
Thank you.
right now.
I was a
Okay?
little disappointed in our previous public hearing about getting the word out, so I'm hoping it will be an improvement from last time.
Okay.
So, a couple things. I think, just really quickly, that I think we've had this interaction that we just had about loss of life versus unintended consequences. I believe we got some clarity just now around what that discussion should look like, or what that agreement could look like. But I have a question for training as well as hot topics about, because each of you mentioned expanding the history of policing, and I was wondering to what extent, how far back chronologically, from a chronological perspective, do you envision this training being?
Well, I'm going to, and I don't know if this is the answer, but I remember very clearly Dr. Jones's presentation, I think it was Dr. Jones's presentation at Franklin. And really, it took it back to policing, as we know today, really started with slavery. And then what happened around Jim Crow days. I mean, those types of things. It wasn't, I must admit, if someone was just hearing that today, they maybe wouldn't know that, but that's the history, of why we even started with policing.
And I agree. And so I was just wondering if that was the expectation or the intent of those committees through those recommendations, because when we get ready to vote, I think it should be very clear chronologically what we believe, because at the end of the day, from my earliest recollections, policing and its impact on my family and my community has been a topic at the feet of the elders. This is the history of it from our perspective has always been shared with us. And so I don't know that that communities that are not of color and individuals who are not of color get that history.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So the full text actually includes very specific topics that we included, and we drew those from, there's a National Academies of Sciences report on the history of policing and kind of the injustices in African-American communities, and also from a model curriculum that's out there that we kind of try to figure out why those topics were not in there. So we definitely have very specific topics that go, I think, as far back as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1794, but that should not be kind of that should not be an exclusive list. That's just things we think are essential, and certainly there's more things that should be added. But I want to make sure that you see the full list as well.
All right, great.
Yeah.
And so just a couple other quick things. When you said, and this is for Hot Topics, Professor, when you say professionally staffed, I think that I would just like to ask if there was consideration of the value that's added by life experiences of individuals from these communities, because professional can imply university, mainstream education, as opposed to what the experience of an individual living in the community across generations could add to this idea of trained and professionally trained.
That's a great question. So I think the professional training was to the specific investigatory tactics and things like that. And so I think what we liked about the Denver model was that it wasn't law enforcement, but it was like former public defenders and people with experience in the field, so they would know what kinds of questions to ask, how to ask questions, how to get evidence. And so, again, I can't speak for the whole committee, but from my perspective, I think that kind of background is necessary because, again, we don't want just random people off the street doing investigations, in part because, again, we want to make sure everybody has confidence in this process. And if I was a police officer and I thought that if it was a complaint against me and it was going to be investigated against somebody without that professional training, I think that might give me hesitation, and that might affect kind of what I do in ways that are perverse, getting at unintended consequences. Right. So we're really trying to be careful to balance those unintended consequences while also creating kind of a fair process and transparent process. But I'll let the other committee members jump in because I don't think we have.
On the Denver group were all in their individual right, very respected people. But that didn't eliminate them from representing the voice of folks who were bringing complaints to them. So, but in the membership of that group were people that you would want to represent you.
So I know Denver had one community, a well-respected community person on that, along with the attorneys and prosecutors and things like that. So the biggest part of what I took away from that is the transparency. Exactly. Even if there wasn't an agreement on the final decision, it was very transparent that the investigation was thorough, it was proper. Anything that they wanted additional questioning on, they were able to provide that feedback to IAB, and they complied with that part of it. And the voters voted for it, so it was very.
It was part of the charter, wasn't it?
They changed their city charter, and it was in concert with their FOP. So, I mean, there was some compromise, obviously, but it was something that they were able to accomplish.
And also, they were very intentional in helping us to understand that it didn't happen overnight.
Right.
Like they kind of got to a place where they had a group of us, like us, meeting, but it took years, it took changes of administration, it took going to the ballot for them to get to where they are. And they still are constantly evaluating and finding other things they could improve upon, but it was a collective effort over time of a city deciding together to take it slow, to move together, to bring everybody along to get to this place.
It was a calming after an event,
yes.
so it was definitely
And it was a
needed.
spike in a very public event that everybody was divided and chose sides, but it took I don't know the timeline as far, maybe Vlad made how many years, but they were intentional of helping us understand it's not going to happen overnight, but these are the steps that we took.
So really quickly, I have one more question, and that was about the data analysis portion of Hot Topics. And I know that you were already working with the Columbus Division of Police, as is Dr. Jones, in data analysis and evaluation in some respect. I don't know the depth of which that takes place, but in any event, the question is, in your data analysis point, where do you see that expanding upon the work that's already being done? And and what needs to be integrated into that. Like you said, the Safe Streets Initiative, under which the work that I do falls. Not that I,
Right.
but
So to clarify, I don't do any work with the division. I think the only work I do is at the request of the commission, looking at the hiring data.
Okay.
But I think the model that certainly I have in mind is in Chicago, where the University of Chicago has a specialized training program for their data analysts, and they teach them kind of very cutting-edge techniques for doing this kind of analysis. That I think it's not obvious to me that our analysts are trained in those, or that we have a system for kind of updating skills as new approaches come online. But I think I don't have anything more specific than that, other than there's ways of doing kind of program evaluation that I think are a little bit more systematic and rigorous than the kind of evaluation we saw for the Safe Streets program.
okay, thank you.
The only evaluation that I really do is with TAPS, that's evaluating the effectiveness of the program and looking at trust, respect, that pre and post test. But I did meet with Chief Quinlan, and he mentioned that they have a research and development unit. So perhaps this is something, I'm throwing this to you, Chief, this may be something that department could look into and perhaps implement and get the training, and that be, a task that they take on. They have, it could potentially work.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally, one other thing, the hiring. Since we're throwing stuff to Chief Quinlan, this past summer, the Franklin County Commissioners issued a challenge to employers throughout Central Ohio to hire young people for the summer. And my question is there room at the academy in these spaces for young people to come on during the summer to work? If we might be able to find dollars in the budget for that, because I think that goes a long way toward building transparency as well as trust and legitimacy. So, just a thought.
Emily,
Oh, sorry. Any further questions? Any questions here? Then again, thank you, commissioners, for I think this is an excellent meeting. Looking forward to seeing you on October the 1st. We are adjourned.